Welcome to the Painting Coach, and the time of the rat is upon us. Yes. In this painting tutorial, I'll show you how to paint a Claw Lord or Gnash-Beast from the brand new Skaventide box set. A huge thank you to Games Workshop for sending it out to me nice and early so I can create this content. Let's get painting. The first thing I've done is primed the model using Wraithbone. I have left the Claw Lord separate, however, so he will pop off. It's just going to make it easier to paint the first few steps. We're going to paint the Gnash-Beast first, but suffice to say, any bits that are the same on the Gnash-Beast, such as bones, metallics, I'm going to paint them exactly the same on the Claw Lords. Just bear that in mind. Now we're going to make a start with the Pallid torn flesh on this Gnash-Beast, and to do that, I'm going to take some Volupous Pink contrast paint. Now I'm going to paint a little bit of it onto the model, not a huge amount. Then I'm going to clean my brush and I'm going to dip it into some contrast medium. I'm then going to brush this into the Volupous Pink while it's still wet, so you will have to move fairly quick for this. And this is going to thin the paint out on the model and really give me that nice effect I'm looking for. And it's going to make it easier to just touch up all the other bits and get that really disgusting pallid look that I'm going for on this model. I'm focusing this on all the bare bits of flesh, so any bits of fur, I'm not worrying about that at the moment. So when that's completely dry, you'll have a nice pinky coloured flesh. Let's start to make it look a little bit more pallid. The first thing I'm going to do is take some Rakarth Flesh and I'm going to dry brush this very lightly over all of the skin. Now what this is going to do is catch those raised areas, but it's going to leave the pinky colours in the recesses, and you'll get a really nice transition here between the different tones. So take your time with this. We're not having too much paint on our brush at all. A nice round dry brush like this Artist Opus Series D is perfect for this job. Once you're finished with the Rakarth Flesh, I'm going to do exactly the same thing using Pallid Witch Flesh. Again, using the same type of dry brush, but I'm just going to focus this a little bit more. And I'm dry brushing in a downward motion, so I'm catching the raised part of the flesh. This gives me a really nice and subtle highlight. Moving on to the fur, I'm going to paint this in a brown colour, and the colour I'm going to use for this is Garaghak Sewer. Now this is a nice brown contrast paint, and you might be wondering why I'm using lots of contrast paints for bases. I just find that they cover so much quicker than if we're using a standard layer paint. I'm going to go in with layer paints to highlight it anyway, but for me it's just a nice quick way of getting a good base coat down. Just be careful not to get it on any bits you've already finished. Whilst I'm waiting for that to dry completely, I'm going to go around and paint all of the claws of the model. Now I'm going to do the same for the Claw Lord as with the beast itself. I'm using Black Legion contrast paint for this. When that Garaghak Sewer is completely dry, I'm going to take some Mournfang Brown, and all I'm looking to do here is paint this very, very quickly and very lightly over the raised areas, catching those bits of fur. Now, I have thinned this down a little bit as well, so it will blend into the model as it dries. You could potentially dry brush this stage as well if you wanted to, but I just wanted to work quite quickly with wet paint to get this on, and it will blend in a little bit as well. To finish highlighting the fur, I'm going to use some Deathclaw Brown. And again, I'm doing exactly the same thing as the last step, but I'm making sure I've got a good tip on my brush, not too much paint, and I'm just focusing this mainly on the fur. So I'm not worrying too much about the fleshy bits. It's all about that fur, and we're just going to work our way around doing lots of short, sharp lines. And where we can, we'll pull our brush along the shape of the model. To highlight the claws, the first thing we'll do is take some Mechanicus Standard Grey. And this is a very straightforward step. We're just going to drag our brush along them, catching the majority, leaving the darker colour in the recesses. Then to finish the highlight, we'll take some Administratum Grey. Now for this step, we're going to be a little bit more refined and a little bit more careful. So we are just going to draw some very thin lines to accentuate the highlight on this step. Now there are several parts of this model that I want to paint white because we're going to use more contrast paint. So the first part is going to be that Warpstone. Now we've got two bits of Warpstone popping out, and we've got lots of boils and pimples. So we're going to paint those as well. And I'm also going to paint the eyes with white. Now I'm using AK white. You can use whatever white that you want. Painting the Warpstone is really easy. All we're going to do is take some Striking Scorpion contrast paint and paint this over those areas. Now because we've got a white base coat underneath, this is going to be very, very bright, and it's really, really going to pop. If you want to highlight the sharpest edges of that Warpstone, all you need to do is take a little bit of Dawn Yellow and just drag it along those really, really sharp edges, and that'll give you a nice pop. For all of the boils and pimples, I'm going to paint these using Ironjawz Yellow. Now, this is a kind of a dirty yellow contrast paint, but it's perfect for this. The only thing I'm going to say is you need to do 2 coats. So paint them all, let them dry, and then add a second coat on there. Not because it's not powerful enough, just because I want more of a pussy yellow colour. Finally, we'll paint the eyes. Now, the colour I'm using for this is Baal Red contrast paint. So just make sure you've got a tiny bit on your brush, paint it into the eye, then clean your brush up very quickly, and then just pop it onto the eye socket itself and soak up a little bit of the contrast paint from the middle, and this will give you a nice glowing red eye. We're going to do all of the bone and the teeth next, and we're going to base them all to start with, and the colour I'm going to use for that is Rhinox Hide, and that's because I want quite a cold bone colour. When that's dry, we'll start to highlight, and the colour we're going to use for this is Zandri Dust. Now, essentially what we're going to do is leave that Rhinox Hide in the recesses, and we're going to take the Zandri Dust and just start to paint in some of the highlights. Don't forget I'm painting the teeth and bones on the Gnash-Beast and also any teeth and bones on the Claw Lord as well. Finally, we'll finish up with some Wraithbone, and this generally is just to paint the tips of the teeth or any bones or horns. And also what we want to do is just paint some very thin lines up into that tip, which just gives us an accentuated highlight. Next up, we'll paint all of the copper coloured areas. So the first thing to do is to base all of this using some Balthasar Gold. Now remember, we're painting it on the Gnash-Beast and the Claw Lord at the same time. So just don't forget to do both. I want to build up a little bit of a verdigris effect on the copper colours, so we're going to wash them using Coelia Greenshade. Now, this is a nice and simple step. The important thing is you don't go overboard and have it pool, so just take your time and obviously be very careful around where this meets other areas of the model. When that's dry, it's time to start highlighting, and the first colour we're going to use is Hashed Copper. Now, this paint does need one heck of a shake and a stir to make sure that it's all mixed quite nicely. But once you've done that, it's a very simple process of just dragging it along the edges and stippling it across various parts of the metallics. The important thing here is that we've got a very dysregular pattern. It's not regular, like sharp highlights. It's just quite spotted from stippling, and this will give you that battered metal effect. We'll give a final highlight to all that brass metal by mixing a little bit of chrome from Valeur Model Air into that Hashed Copper. Now this is a little bit more red in colour than something like a Canoptek alloy, so this is more of the effect we want, and generally what we're looking to do with this is just catch those sharp edges by dragging the brush along them, maybe accentuating some of the damage to the armour as well. I'm then going to take a tiny bit of Lilac Oxide and just paint this into the recesses and down towards the bottom of the metallic areas where perhaps a little bit of the corrosion will start to build up first. So use this fairly sparingly. It's easier to do that. You can always go back in and add more if you need to. Now we'll make a start on the Claw Lord. Remember, I've been painting him the same as the rest of the model at the same time in the background. So the first thing we'll do is get this armour based. And the colour we're going to use is Baal Red contrast paint. This is lovely. It covers in one coat. Just be careful not to get it on any bits that you don't want to be red. So take your time. Next up, I'm going to paint any silver parts on the model. And the colour I'm using for this is Dark Aluminium from Vallejo's Metal Colour range. Now, if you haven't got this, you can use something like Lead Belcher. You can use Coat Silver from Two Thin Coats. If that's your preferred metal, it doesn't really matter. Just get a nice coat across all of the bits you want to be silver. I'm then going to wash all of the armour and the silver using Agrax Earthshade, which is a nice brown tone and just makes things look a little bit dirtier than perhaps they would if we used Null Oil, which is probably a little bit too clean. Don't worry if this pools too much on the armour. We do want to work it into the recesses, so don't obviously have lots and lots of brown puddles on there. So just keep an eye on it as it dries. We'll move on to the flesh of the Claw Lord next. I've actually attached him now to the Gnash-Beast, as that's going to make it easier to hold everything. So all I'm doing is taking some Guilliman Flesh contrast paint and painting this all over the fleshy bits, such as the face, the hands, the arms, and of course the tail and the feet. Once that's dry, I'm going to paint all of his fur, and the colour I'm using for this is Black Templar contrast paint. Now, this gives you a really nice highlight without having to worry too much. The important thing is you don't spill it too much onto the fleshy areas. If you do, clean your brush off and just try and soak up as much of it as you can. I'm also going to paint the bandages on his weapon because it's going to give a really nice dirty colour to those as well. We'll start highlighting the flesh using Flayed One Flesh. Now this is a nice bright colour. What we're looking to do here is catch the most raised parts. There's plenty of texture on there as well. And don't forget to paint the feet and the hands at the same time whilst you're doing this. This is a nice and easy, straightforward step. Just take your time because we are talking about a very small model. Finally, we'll finish off that flesh with some Pallid Witch Flesh. And generally what I'm looking to do here is just catch the most raised areas. So we've got things like the brow, the top of the ear, the top of the mouth, and also parts of the tail. Now I'm going to give that fur a highlight the same way as we did the claws. So first off, I'm going to take some Mechanicus Standard Grey, and I'm going to paint this all across the raised areas. Now, if you're very good or if you've got a very small brush, you can just drag it along the model across the texture to pick it up, and that's a nice, easy way to do this stage. Once you've done that, take some Administratum Grey and use this fairly sparingly, really good tip on your brush, and just paint this on as well so that the hair still looks like it's black, but it does have a nice highlight. I wanted to paint the cloak and robes a little bit different to what's on the box art, so I've decided to paint them a dark blue colour. To do this, I'm going to base them using Leviathan Blue contrast paint. So take your time with this. Make sure you get it onto the cloak and only the cloak. You don't want to spill it onto areas that you've already finished. Once you've got that first coat on and it's completely dry, add a second coat of Leviathan Blue. Now, if you haven't got Leviathan Blue, you can try something like Cantor Blue, and then you can just give it a wash with some Nuln Oil. Started highlighting using Cantor Blue. I painted this over quite a bit of the cloth, only leaving that Leviathan Blue in the darkest recesses. Take your time with this and just be fairly sparing. If you think you need to add a bit more, you can always go back in and do this. The first chunky highlight is with Alatok Blue. And again, I'm not being too careful with this, really. I'm painting it on quite thickly across the raised areas, catching all the bits that are not in shadow. So just take your time. Where you can, drag your brush across the folds to get the nice crisper highlights, but generally don't worry too much about this. The final highlight is with Hoeth Blue, and for this step I'm being a little bit more careful. I'm looking to drag the brush along the edges a lot more to get a nice crisper highlight. Towards the bottom, I don't mind if it's a little bit thick and it kind of blends into brightening that lower half. That's absolutely fine. But generally, I'm looking to make this a little bit scuffed. So whilst I'm dragging the brush, I might pull it off and back on in like a stippling motion, just to give me some variation in the highlights. Moving on to the armour, the first thing we're going to do is take some Evil Sun Scarlet, and I'm going to stipple this across all of the armour panels, focusing on the edges and the parts that are facing upwards. And this is going to give me a really nice highlight, but it's not going to give me one that's consistent. It's going to give me a blotchy highlight, and this is going to add into the overall effect of the model, that things are battered, things are dirty. I'm going to follow that up with some Wild Rider Red, and again tapping my brush along the edges to get some jagged highlights. Now it's worth saying, and I probably should have said this earlier, that I'm going into a lot more detail on this model than I would on a normal clan rat, for example. So whilst I'm doing lots of highlights, because this is one of the centerpiece models for the army, if you're painting your clan rats, you can leave out most of the steps. You can work the contrast, wash, and a highlight, and I think they'd be fine. I'm going to finish off the armour with some spots of Fire Dragon Bright. I'm using this very sparingly, particularly around parts of armour where it's damaged. This is where most of the paint is going to flick off from. I want to paint the Claw Lord's blade next. I'm not sure if it's a halberd. It kind of looks a bit like a halberd. But anyway, I want to base it in white. And again, I'm using AK white for this. You can use whatever white that you've got. Now, on the box art, the blade has got a nice green glow in the middle. So we're going to try and replicate that. And we're going to go quite quickly. So maybe watch this section first before you try it yourself. First up, we'll take some striking Scorpion Green and paint this into those areas that we want to be the brightest colour. Once we're happy with that, we'll take some Corandrous Green and paint this around the edges of the striking Scorpion Green. Now, as it touches, it will run in and blend a little bit. We're doing this all completely wet, so we'll take some Warp Lightning and paint this around the edge of the blade. Again, this will start to blend into the colours underneath. And then finally, we'll take some Dark Angel's Green and we'll paint this around the extreme edges. Again, it'll blend into the colours in the middle. It's worth saying, if you make any mistakes, you can always clean your brush off and wipe off that last stage while it's still wet. If after all that the blade looks a little dark like mine is here, you can just go back in and add the brighter spots. First in, paint them back in with some white. Now again, you may need to do maybe 2 coats to get this to cover it properly. Then go back to striking Scorpion Green and you'll get that really nice green glow effect back in. Just keep an eye with the brush that you soak up any excess so you still keep that bright spot. When that's dry, I'm going to start to highlight using some moot green. Now this is an optional stage, I just want to do it to make the blade pop a bit more. I'm dragging it across all those sharp edges. This isn't a crisp highlight, but if you do want a crisp one, then you can just go back in and fix it with some of the contrast paints after. Finally, I'm going to take some Dawn Yellow and just highlight the absolute brightest parts of this to give it that nice glow. For the haft of the weapon, I've already based it using Rhinox Hide. I'm now going to take a bit of Garaghak stone to highlight it. I'm doing this very, very roughly and not particularly tidily. To help homogenize all of that, I'm going to take some Agrax Earthshade and just brush it over the wood sections. To finish off, I'm going to highlight the silver. All I'm doing is taking some chrome from Vallejo Model Air and just popping it on where I think it's going to catch the most light. So this is a nice and easy, fairly straightforward task. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to paint all of the studs on the armor with this as well. So this is something that you just need to take a little bit of care over because it can be quite challenging and you can make mistakes. So like I said, just take your time. And with that, the Claw Lord or Gnash-Beast is done. You can go away and paint the base however you want. I've just done a very simple brown base with a bit of dry brushing and then use some contrast paint over that pool to make it look like it's glowing. Like I said, so easy and so straightforward. So I really hope you enjoyed this video. Do you want to see more Skaven painted? If you do, let me know down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.